Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Eleanor May learned this truth on a storm-battered night when she opened her door to a stranger who had nowhere else to go. Through the long night, they sat by lantern light as rain hammered the roof. She gave him coffee, a blanket, and a safe place to rest. He was just a weary mountain man seeking shelter, or so she thought. When morning came, he told her something that stopped her heart. He owned the land her homestead sat on, every acre. But instead of taking it back, he made her an offer she never saw coming. What would make a man give up everything to a woman he'd just met? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and approaching weather. Eleanor May Hartwell stood on her porch, one hand shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun as she surveyed the valley below. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to endure. Her dark hair, threaded with silver at the temples, was pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands were work-worn, capable hands that had learned to do the labor of two people in the 3 years since Thomas had passed. The homestead sat on a natural shelf carved into the Montana mountainside, overlooking a valley that stretched for miles before rising again into distant peaks. Thomas had chosen this spot 15 years ago, had built their cabin with his own hands, log by careful log. The structure was solid, weathered now but still standing strong against the elements. A barn stood 30 yards from the main house, flanked by a chicken coop and a small smokehouse. The garden plot, once abundant, showed signs of struggle this season. Some crops had taken well, but others had failed despite her best efforts. Eleanor descended the porch steps and walked toward the well. The simple gold band on her left hand caught the fading light. She touched it unconsciously, a habit she had maintained since the day Thomas slipped it on her finger in the small church down in Pine Ridge. 20 years they had together. 20 years of building a life in this remote country, of shared dreams and quiet contentments. Then pneumonia had taken him in late winter 3 years ago, and she had been alone ever since. She drew water from the well, the rope rough against her palms. The bucket came up full and cold, fresh from the mountain spring that fed the underground source. This water had never failed them, even in the driest summers. It was one of the reasons Thomas had chosen this particular piece of land. He had understood the land, had read it like other men read books. He knew where to build, where to plant, how to work with the mountain instead of against it. Eleanor carried the bucket back toward the cabin, pausing to scatter feed for the chickens. They clucked and fussed around her feet, familiar and comforting in their simple routines. She had 12 hens and 1 rooster, enough to keep her in eggs with some to spare for trading in town. The cow, Bess, lowed from the barn, reminding Eleanor that evening milking would be needed soon. Inside the cabin, everything held its place with the order of a solitary life. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with Thomas's carpentry tools still hanging above the mantel where he had placed them. Eleanor could not bring herself to move them. They belonged there, silent witnesses to the life they had built together. She prepared her simple supper beans she had soaked that morning, cornbread from the last of the previous week's baking, and coffee strong enough to keep her alert through the evening chores. She ate alone at the table Thomas had made, sitting in the chair he had crafted for her, looking at the empty chair across from her that had once held him. The loneliness was heaviest at mealtimes. During the day, there was enough work to keep her mind occupied. But in these quiet moments, the absence pressed in. She was managing, but just barely. The roof needed repairs in 2 places. The barn door hung crooked on hinges. She lacked the strength to reset properly. Fence posts were rotting in the far pasture, and she knew the coming winter would see them fall completely. She had considered selling, moving back down to Pine Ridge where her sister lived. But this land was Thomas's dream, their dream together. Every board, every stone, every planted seed represented their shared labor and love. To abandon, it felt like abandoning him, like admitting that everything they had built meant nothing without him here to see it. After supper, Eleanor washed her few dishes and set them to dry. She lit the brass storm lantern that hung by the door, trimming the wick carefully. Thomas had bought that lantern on their 10th anniversary, presenting it to her with shy pride. It burned clean and bright, had guided them through countless dark nights. Through the window, she could see the sky changing. Clouds were building over the western peaks, dark and heavy with rain. The wind had picked up, carrying the electric smell of a storm. Eleanor had lived in these mountains long enough to read the signs. This would not be a gentle rain, but a true mountain tempest, the kind that could blow for hours and leave the trails washed out and dangerous. She stepped onto the porch, drawing her shawl tighter against the cooling air. The chickens had already roosted, sensing the coming weather. Bess was secured in the barn with fresh hay and water. Eleanor had learned to prepare for storms with the thoroughness Thomas had taught her. You did not take chances in this country. The mountains were beautiful but unforgiving to those who failed to respect them. The first drops of rain arrived as she secured the barn door for the night. Large, cold drops that struck with purpose. Thunder rumbled in the distance, still miles away but approaching steadily. Eleanor hurried back to the cabin, latching the door behind her and checking the window shutters. She added wood to the fire, building it up to last through the night. She settled into her rocking chair, the one Thomas had made for her when they first learned she was carrying their child. The baby had not lived, born too early and too small to survive in this harsh climate. There had been no others after. It was a sorrow they had carried together, had learned to live with, even as it hollowed out a space in both their hearts. Eleanor picked up her mending, more to occupy her hands than from any real need. Outside, the storm gathered strength. Rain began to hammer against the roof, driven by wind that howled around the cabin's corners. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in brief, stark moments. Thunder followed, rolling through the valley like the voice of the mountains themselves. She thought about the coming winter, about how she would manage another season alone. Her supplies were adequate but not abundant. She had some money saved, but it would not last forever. Pride had kept her from accepting too much help from neighbors, but she knew that pride was a luxury she might not be able to afford much longer. The storm lantern cast its steady glow, a small circle of warmth and light against the darkness pressing in from outside. Eleanor continued her mending, listening to the rain, feeling the solitude settle around her like a familiar but unwelcome blanket. She had no way of knowing that within hours, everything would change, that a stranger would come knocking at her door, desperate and drenched, that her simple act of frontier hospitality would set in motion events that would transform her life completely, that the man seeking shelter from the storm carried with him a secret that would shake the very foundation of everything she believed about her home and her future. For now, she sat by lamplight, alone with her memories and her worries, while the mountain storm raged on and the night deepened around her small homestead, perched on the edge of the vast Montana wilderness. The storm had reached its full fury when Eleanor heard the knocking. At first, she thought it was just a branch, torn loose and flung against the door by the wind. But then it came again, deliberate and desperate, the unmistakable sound of a human hand striking wood. She set down her mending and rose from the chair, her heart suddenly beating faster. No one traveled these mountain trails in weather like this. No one with any sense would be out in such conditions. Yet someone was at her door, and by the urgency of that knocking, they were in genuine need. Eleanor approached the door cautiously. She was a woman alone, miles from the nearest neighbor. Thomas had taught her to be careful, to think before acting. But he had also taught her the code of the frontier. You did not turn away someone in need, not in country that could kill the unprepared. "Who's there?" She called through the heavy wooden door. A man's voice answered, rough and strained. "Please, ma'am, I need shelter from the storm. I mean no harm." Eleanor hesitated, her hand on the door latch. Every instinct told her to be wary, yet the man's voice carried a note of genuine desperation. Outside, lightning split the sky, and the thunder that followed shook the cabin's walls. Whatever else this stranger might be, he was in danger out there. She lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the wind's resistance. The man who stood on her porch was a sight that gave her pause. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders hunched against the driving rain. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to a frame that was lean but powerful. A beard covered the lower half of his face, dark and unkempt. His hair hung, in wet ropes, to his collar. But it was his eyes that struck her most pale blue, almost grey, and filled with a weariness that went deeper than mere physical exhaustion. "Please," he said again, and something in that single word decided her. Eleanor stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Come in then, quickly, before the rain floods the floor." The man entered, bringing with him the smell of rain and mountain pine. He carried a worn leather satchel, which he set carefully by the door. Water pooled around his boots on the wooden floor. "I'm grateful, ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I wouldn't have troubled you, but I misjudged the weather. Got caught higher up the mountain than I intended." Eleanor closed the door against the storm and turned to study her unexpected guest. In the lamplight, she could see him more clearly. Despite his rough appearance, there was something about him that did not quite fit the image of a common drifter. His hands, though work-worn, had long fingers that suggested capability beyond mere labor. His speech, while simple, carried no hint of coarseness. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes," she said, falling back on the practical concerns that allowed her to push aside her nervousness. "I have a blanket you can wrap in while your things dry by the fire." She moved to the chest, where she kept spare linens, and pulled out a heavy wool blanket, one of the ones Thomas's mother had made years ago. She handed it to the stranger, then turned her back to give him privacy. "Thank you," he said quietly. She heard the rustle of wet fabric being removed, the soft sound of the blanket being wrapped around shoulders. "You can turn around now, ma'am." Eleanor turned to find him standing by the fire, the blanket draped around him like a cloak. He had spread his wet clothes over the backs of chairs near the hearth. Without the concealing bulk of his coat, she could see that he was younger than she had first. Thought perhaps in his late 30s, not much younger than herself. "I'll make coffee," she said, needing something to do with her hands. "You look like you could use something hot." "I would appreciate that more than I can say." She busied herself with the coffee pot, adding grounds and water, setting it over the fire to boil. The familiar routine steadied her nerves. The man stood silently, holding his hands toward the flames, not speaking unless spoken to. She appreciated his restraint, his understanding of the awkwardness of the situation. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and handed him one. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, and she pulled back quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," he said, wrapping both hands around the cup as if it were precious. He took a careful sip and closed his eyes. "That's fine coffee." "It's just coffee," Eleanor said, but she felt a small warmth at the compliment. Nonetheless, they stood in silence for a moment, the storm providing all the conversation needed. Rain drummed against the roof in steady sheets. Wind rattled the shutters. Lightning flickered through the cracks, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. "I'm James," the man said finally. "James Callahan." Eleanor considered not giving her name, maintaining that final barrier of anonymity. But frontier hospitality had its own rules, and she had already invited him into her home. "Eleanor Hartwell," she replied. "This is my homestead." "I can see you keep it well," James said, his eyes moving around the room with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "Takes considerable effort to maintain a place like this in country like this." "My husband built this cabin," Eleanor heard herself say. "He had a gift for such things." "Had?" James asked gently, picking up on the past tense. "He passed 3 years ago. I've been managing alone since then. Something shifted in James's expression, understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hartwell. It can't have been easy. No, Eleanor admitted. It hasn't been easy, but it's my home, and I mean to keep it. James nodded slowly, as if her words carried more weight than she knew. He took another sip of coffee, his gaze returning to the fire. You can sleep in that corner, Eleanor said, pointing to a space near the fireplace where the heat would be strongest. I'll get you another blanket for bedding. You're very kind, James said. More than I deserve, turning up on your doorstep in the middle of the night. Anyone would do the same, Eleanor replied, though she knew that was not quite true. Some would have turned him away, fear overriding compassion. She retrieved another blanket and handed it to him, careful not to meet his eyes too directly. I'll be in my room, she said, gesturing to the door that led to her small bedroom. If you need anything, the water bucket is by the door, and there's bread in the box on the shelf. I'll be fine, ma'am. Thank you again. Eleanor retreated to her bedroom, closing the door but not latching it completely. She lay down on her bed, fully clothed, listening to the sounds from the main room. She heard James settle into his corner, heard the rustle of blankets being arranged, the fire crackled and popped. The storm continued its assault on the cabin's walls. Sleep would not come easily, she knew. There was a stranger in her home, a man she knew nothing about beyond a name and a polite manner. Yet somehow she did not feel the fear she knew she should feel. There was something about James Callahan that spoke of decency, of a man who carried his own burdens and understood the weight of hers. She lay in the darkness, listening to the storm and wondering what dawn would bring. She had no way of knowing that the man sleeping by her fire carried papers in that leather satchel, papers that would change everything. That he had not stumbled upon her homestead by accident, but had been searching for this specific piece of land. That he knew things about her property that she did not know herself. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, two solitary people found unexpected shelter not just from the weather, but from the loneliness that had been hounding them both for far too long. And as the night wore on toward an uncertain dawn, the mountain kept its secrets close, waiting to see what the morning light would reveal. The first days of their arrangement passed in careful formality. James moved his few belongings to the barn, fashioning himself a sleeping area in the loft where the hay was stored. He rose before dawn each morning and worked until darkness fell, always asking Eleanor's permission before beginning any task, always respectful of her space and her authority over the homestead. Eleanor watched him work with a mixture of relief and suspicion that gradually shifted towards something else, a cautious appreciation. James Callahan was not a man who simply talked about helping. He threw himself into the labor with a dedication that surprised her. The roof repairs that she had been dreading took him only 2 days. He rehung the barn door, its hinges straightened and reinforced. He rode the fence line and came back with a list of posts that needed replacing before winter. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had to admit that his presence had already made a noticeable difference. The homestead had an air of order and care that it had lacked for too long. More than that, she found herself looking forward to their evening meals, when they would sit at the table and talk about the day's work. "The far pasture fence is worse than I thought," James said one evening, accepting a second helping of stew. "We'll need to replace at least a dozen posts. I can ride down to Pine Ridge tomorrow, purchase the lumber and hardware." "That will be expensive," Eleanor said, worry creeping into her voice. "I have some money saved, but—" "I'll cover the expenses," James interrupted gently. "I have funds from my father's estate. Let me contribute to the property's upkeep. It's only fair." Eleanor hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "I don't want to be beholden to you." "You're not beholden to me," James replied. "We're partners, remember? Partners invest in their shared enterprise. Besides, if I'm going to live here, I want the fences secure. Come winter, we might need every bit of protection this land can provide." She nodded slowly, accepting his logic even as it made her uncomfortable. She had been independent for so long, made all her own decisions, answered to no one. Having someone else involved in the homestead's management felt strange, but she could not deny it was also a relief. The next day, James rode to Pine Ridge with a list of supplies. Eleanor gave him letters to mail and a list of groceries to purchase. She watched him ride down the mountain trail, sitting his horse with easy confidence, and realized that she trusted him to return. Somewhere in the past week, that fundamental trust had taken root without her quite noticing. He came back before dark, his horse laden with supplies. He had bought everything on her list and added a few items. She had not requested a new Dutch oven to replace her cracked one, coffee beans of a better quality than she usually purchased, and a length of fabric in a deep blue that made him look almost embarrassed when he presented it. "I thought you might like it," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. For a new dress, perhaps. The woman at the general store said it was good quality. Eleanor took the fabric, running her fingers over the soft wool. She could not remember the last time someone had given her something simply because they thought she would like it. "Thank you," she said quietly. That was thoughtful. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed between them. James worked on the heavy repairs and maintenance that Eleanor could not manage alone. She continued her daily routines, tending the garden, caring for the chickens, and Bess, managing the household. They shared meals and conversation, the initial awkwardness gradually giving way to something more comfortable. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the distant peaks, James asked about Thomas. Eleanor had been waiting for this question, knowing it would come eventually. She took a breath and began to share, telling him about the man who had built this cabin with his own hands, who had loved the mountains and understood how to live in harmony with their harsh beauty. "He was patient," Eleanor said, her voice soft with memory. "I was a town girl, knew nothing about frontier life when we married. He taught me everything: how to read the weather, how to preserve food, how to fix things when they broke. He never made me feel foolish for not knowing." James listened without interrupting, his attention focused entirely on her words. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "He sounds like a good man, the kind of man who builds things that last." "He was," Eleanor agreed. "This homestead was his dream. I'm just trying to keep it alive for him." "I think you're doing more than that," James said. "I think you're honoring his memory by making it yours as well." The words touched something deep in Eleanor's heart. She glanced at James, seeing him in the fading light, and felt a flutter of something she could not quite name. She looked away quickly, disturbed by the sensation. The following Sunday, they rode together to Pine Ridge for church services. The appearance of Eleanor with a man at her side caused considerable stir among the congregation. After the service, neighbors approached with barely concealed curiosity. "Eleanor," Martha Collins said, her eyes bright with interest. "Who is your companion?" "This is Mr. Callahan," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice neutral. "He's helping with repairs on the homestead." "How nice for you," Martha said, though her tone suggested she thought it was something else entirely. "It must be good to have a man around the place again." Eleanor felt James tense beside her, but he said nothing, letting her handle the social navigation. She appreciated his discretion, his understanding that her reputation in this small community mattered. On the ride home, James finally spoke. "I'm sorry if my presence causes you difficulties with your neighbors. They'll gossip regardless of what I do," Eleanor said, with more bitterness than she intended. "A widow woman is expected to either remarry quickly or live like a nun. There's no middle ground in their thinking." "Still," James said, "I don't want to make your life harder." Eleanor looked at him, seeing the genuine concern in his expression. "You're making my life easier in every way that matters. Let them talk. I know the truth of our arrangement, and so do you. That's what counts." But as they rode on through the afternoon light, Eleanor wondered if she was being entirely honest with herself. The truth of their arrangement was simple: on paper, a partnership of convenience, nothing more. but the feelings growing in her heart were becoming increasingly complicated. She caught herself watching James work, admiring the capable way he moved, the quiet confidence he brought to every task. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the sound of his voice and the warmth of his rare smile. At night, lying alone in her bed, she would think about the empty cabin on the other side of the wall and Thomas's tools hanging silent above the fireplace. She would touch her wedding ring and wonder if she was betraying his memory by feeling drawn to another man. The guilt was real, but so was the loneliness that James's presence had begun to ease. One evening, as they worked together preparing vegetables for canning, their hands touched in the shared bowl of water. Both pulled back as if burned, and in that moment of awkward tension, Eleanor knew that James felt it too, this growing awareness, this dangerous attraction neither of them had intended or planned for. "I should check on Bess," James said abruptly, standing and leaving the cabin without another word. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly, knowing that their careful arrangement was becoming something else entirely, something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge or name. Autumn deepened across the mountains, painting the aspens gold and sending the first hard frosts to silver the morning grass. James and Eleanor worked together to prepare for winter, a season that would test their partnership in ways neither had fully considered. The barn was stocked with hay. The root cellar was filled with preserved vegetables and canned goods. Firewood was split and stacked high against the cabin wall. Through it all, they maintained a careful distance, both aware of the growing tension between them and both uncertain how to address it. James had moved from the barn to the small storage room attached to the cabin, a concession to the dropping temperatures and Eleanor's concern that he would freeze in the unheated loft. The room was barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, but it was warm and dry, and James insisted it was more comfort than he deserved. One afternoon, Eleanor was working in her garden, gathering the last of the season's seeds to save for spring planting. James was nearby, repairing a section of fence, when she heard his voice. "What are those?" he asked, walking over to watch her work. "Seeds," Eleanor said, holding out her hand to show him the small collection. "From the best plants of each crop, you save them dry and protected through winter, then plant them come spring. That way, you always have what you need for the next season." James looked at the seeds with something like wonder, planning for a future you haven't seen yet, trusting that spring will come even in the depth of winter. "That's farming," Eleanor said with a small smile. "That's faith, I suppose." James was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to keep a garden. Before she died, when I was young, I remember her saving seeds like this, wrapping them in paper and storing them in a box." Eleanor heard the longing in his voice. "You miss her?" "I do," James admitted. "She was the only person who ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere. After she was gone, I was just in the way, an obligation my father's family had to honor but didn't want." Eleanor set down her seeds and looked at him directly. "You're not in the way here, James. You know that, don't you?" He met her eyes, and for a moment the careful distance between them dissolved. "I'm beginning to," he said quietly. "Thanks to you." Moments stretched, charged with unspoken feeling, until Eleanor looked away, her heart beating faster than it should. "Help me finish here," she said, her voice not quite steady. "We should get these stored before the wind picks up." They worked together in silence, and when their hands touched over the seed basket, neither pulled away quite as quickly as they had before. That evening they sat by the fire after supper, the autumn chill making the warmth of the hearth especially welcome. Eleanor was sewing patches on work shirts, and James was reading from an old book he had found on her shelf, one of Thomas's favorites, she noticed with a pang. "Eleanor," James said suddenly, setting down the book. The use of her first name, which had become natural between them over the weeks, still sent a small thrill through her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever feel guilty? About moving forward, I mean. About letting yourself be happy again after loss?" Eleanor sat down, her sewing, understanding immediately what he was really asking. "Every day," she admitted, "I feel like I'm betraying Thomas's memory every time I laugh, every time I enjoy something, every time I think about a future that doesn't include him." "But you go on living anyway," James said. "I do, because I think that's what he would want." Thomas loved life. He loved this land, loved working with his hands, loved building things. He wouldn't want all of that to die with him. He would want the homestead to thrive, want someone to care for it and appreciate it the way he did. James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "And do you think he would want you to be happy, to find companionship again, maybe even love?" Eleanor's breath caught. They were treading on dangerous ground now, speaking of things that had remained carefully unspoken. "I think," she said slowly, "that Thomas was a generous man who wanted good things for people he cared about. I think he would rather see me building a new life than grieving forever over the old one. Even if that new life included another man." Eleanor looked at James, really looked at him, seeing the hope and fear mixed in his expression. "James, what are we doing here?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I came here looking for land, for property, for something I could claim as mine. Instead, I found you. And every day, I find myself caring less about legal deeds and ownership and caring more about whether you smile, whether you're safe, whether you're happy. James, I know this isn't what we agreed to," he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he had been holding them back for too long. "I know you gave me a trial period, a chance to prove I could be useful, but somewhere along the way, this stopped being about the homestead for me. It started being about you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I'm afraid of dishonoring Thomas. I'm afraid of trusting these feelings. I'm afraid that if I let myself care for you, something will happen and I'll lose everything all over again." James crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I'm afraid too," he said. "I'm afraid that I'll do something wrong, say something that drives you away. I'm afraid that I'm not good enough for you, that you'll wake up one day and realize you deserve better than a man who ran away from everything he knew." Eleanor reached out, hesitantly, and touched his face. His beard was softer than she expected, his skin warm beneath her palm. "You didn't run away from anything important. You ran toward something better, toward a life that meant something." James closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "Toward you. It turns out, even though I didn't know it at the time." They sat there in the firelight, the first acknowledgement of their feelings hanging in the air between them. Neither knew quite what to do next, how to move forward from this moment of vulnerability and truth. But both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful partnership they had maintained was transforming into something deeper and more complicated. Finally, James pulled back gently and returned to his chair. "We should take this slowly," he said. "I don't want to rush you, or pressure you, or make you feel like you have to choose before you're ready." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding even as part of her wished he had stayed close. "Slowly," she agreed, "one day at a time." But as they returned to their evening tasks, both knew that slowly or not, their hearts were already making choices. Their minds had not quite caught up to yet. The visitors arrived on a cold October afternoon, 3 men on horseback riding up the trail with the confidence of people who expected to be received. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she saw them coming. Something in their approach made her uneasy. She called for James, who was working in the barn. He emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, and his expression darkened when he saw the riders. "Go inside," he said quietly to Eleanor, "but stay close to the window. Who are they?" "I don't know, but I don't like the look of them." The 3 men reined in their horses in front of the cabin. The leader was a thin man in a suit that was too fine for the frontier, with a face like a weasel and small, calculating eyes. The other two were clearly hired muscle, large men with guns worn openly on their hips and faces that suggested violence was familiar to them. "Mr. Callahan, I presume?" the thin man said, dismounting with an awkward grace that showed he was not comfortable on horseback. "My name is Silas Thornton. I represent the Mountain Valley Investment Company. We have business to discuss." James crossed his arms, making no move to invite them inside. "State your business, then." Thornton pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and extracted several documents. "It's come to our attention that you claim ownership of this property based on a deed inherited from your late father, Robert Callahan. Is that correct?" "It is. I'm afraid there's a problem with that claim, Mr. Callahan." Thornton's smile was as cold as the October wind. "You see, our company has documentation showing that this land was never properly registered to Robert Callahan. The original purchase was incomplete. Taxes were paid, yes, but the final transfer of title never occurred, according to territorial law that makes this land available for legitimate purchase, which our company executed 6 months ago." Eleanor, watching from the window, as James had instructed, felt her blood run cold. She stepped out onto the porch, unable to stay silent. "That's not possible. My husband bought this land legally 15 years ago." Thornton's eyes flickered to her with barely disguised contempt. "And who might you be, madam?" "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. This is my homestead." "Ah, yes. The widow squatter." Thornton consulted his papers. "I'm afraid your husband's purchase was as fraudulent as Mr. Callahan's inheritance. He bought the land from someone who had no legal right to sell it. Our company is the rightful owner, and we're here to serve notice. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." "Let me see those documents," James said, his voice dangerously calm. Thornton handed them over with a flourish. James read through them slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. Eleanor watched him, her heart pounding. When he finally looked up, she saw anger in his eyes, but also something else concern. "These papers are professionally done," James admitted. "Very convincing, but they're built on a false premise. My father's purchase was legally completed. I have the original deed, properly registered and sealed by the territorial governor himself." "A forgery, obviously," Thornton said smoothly. "Our legal team has verified our claim through multiple sources. The Territorial Land Office has confirmed our ownership." "Which clerk at the Land Office?" James asked sharply. "Which official signed off on this?" Thornton's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not at liberty to disclose the details of our legal process. The point is, the law is on our side. You have 30 days, Mr. Callahan. I suggest you use that time to find somewhere else to live. Otherwise, we'll be forced to remove you by legal means or other means, if necessary." The two hired men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their guns. The threat was clear and unmistakable. James stepped forward, and Eleanor saw something in his bearing change. This was not the quiet man who had been helping with her fences and repairs. This was someone else, someone harder and more dangerous. "You should leave now," he said softly. "Before you say something you'll regret." Thornton backed toward his horse. 30 days, Mr. Callahan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He mounted awkwardly and turned his horse. "Oh, and one more thing. There are people back east who are very interested in your whereabouts. People who would pay well for information about where Robert Callahan's runaway son ended up. It would be a shame if they found out." They rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and threat hanging in the afternoon air. Eleanor came down from the porch, her mind reeling. "James, what was he talking about? What people back east?" James was still staring after the departing riders, his jaw tight. "We need to talk," he said finally. "There are things I haven't told you. Things I should have told you from the beginning." They went inside, and James paced the room like a caged animal. Eleanor watched him, fear and confusion warring in her chest. Finally, he stopped and faced her. "I told you my father wanted me to make a political marriage," he began. "What I didn't tell you was who the family was, the Blackwells of Philadelphia. Powerful, connected, and not the kind of people who accept being refused. The marriage wasn't just about money, it was about control. They wanted access to my father's Western holdings, his connections in the territorial government, his influence. And you refused," Eleanor said. "I did more than refuse. I exposed some of their business practices, illegal land deals, bribery of officials, fraud. I was working in my uncle's law office. I had access to documents, proof of what they were doing. I gave that proof to a federal investigator." Eleanor sat down heavily. "So they're not just angry. They're threatened." "Exactly. When I disappeared, they couldn't retaliate openly. But they've been looking for me, and now they've found me, or at least they know where I am." James ran a hand through his hair. "Those men weren't really from any investment company. Or, if they are, it's just a front. This is the Blackwells trying to force me out, trying to make me vulnerable so they can either get their revenge or force me to come back and keep quiet about what I know." "But the documents they showed you," Eleanor said, her legal mind grasping at straws. "You said they were professionally done, because the Blackwells have the money and connections to fabricate whatever they need. They probably did bribe someone at the land office. They probably do have paperwork that looks legitimate. That's how they operate, everything legal on the surface, all corruption underneath." Eleanor felt the walls of her world closing in. "So we have 30 days before they take everything." "They're not taking anything," James said fiercely. "I won't let them. I know how to fight this, Eleanor. I have the original deed, and I have legal training. I can challenge their claim, expose the fraud. But can you do it in 30 days? James was quiet, and that silence was answer enough. Eleanor stood and walked to the fireplace, looking at Thomas's tools hanging there. She thought about everything she had fought to keep, everything she was about to lose. And she thought about James, who had come into her life by accident or by fate, who had offered her partnership and then something more, who was now revealed to be even more complicated than she had imagined. "There's something else," James said quietly. "Something you need to know before you decide whether you want me to stay and fight this with you." Eleanor turned to face him. "What?" "My father wasn't just a landowner. He was a territorial judge before he retired. He had connections throughout the government, people who respected him and trusted his judgment. Some of those people are still in power. If I can reach them, if I can present the true facts of this case, we might have a chance." "Then do it," Eleanor said simply. "Reach out to them. Fight this." "It means putting you in the middle of something dangerous," James warned. "The Blackwells don't stop when people oppose them. They escalate. If I stay here and fight, they'll come after both of us. They'll use you to get to me." Eleanor crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "I'm already in the middle of it, James. This is my home they're trying to steal. My life they're trying to destroy. If you think we can fight them and win, then we fight together." James looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Eleanor said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Fear was present, yes, but so was something else, a fierce determination not to let these people take what she and Thomas had built, what she and James were building now. "Then we fight," James said, "but we do it smart. First thing tomorrow, I ride to the territorial capital. I'll meet with the officials my father knew, present our case, expose Thornton and whoever's behind him. It'll take a few days, maybe a week." "I'll be fine here alone," Eleanor said, though the prospect frightened her. "No." James's voice was firm. "You come with me. I'm not leaving you here vulnerable. They might try something while I'm gone, and I won't risk that. The homestead will be here when we get back. The animals will survive a week with enough food and water. We'll ask the Millers to check on them. But you come with me, Eleanor. We do this together." Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what they were about to undertake. Tomorrow they would ride for the capital, would put their case before officials, and hope that justice would prevail. But tonight they had each other, and they had the truth, and sometimes that had to be enough. Outside, the October wind picked up, carrying the first scent of winter snow. Inside, two people stood together, facing an uncertain future, but no longer facing it alone. They spent the evening preparing for the journey. Eleanor packed food for several days on the trail, while James checked their horses and gathered the documents they would need. The weight of what they were about to face hung heavy in the air, but so did something else, a sense of unity, of shared purpose that made the burden feel more bearable. As Eleanor worked, she thought about how much had changed since that storm night when James had knocked at her door. Then she had been alone, struggling, holding on to her home through sheer stubborn will. Now she was fighting for that home still, but she was not alone, and somehow that made all the difference. After dark, they sat together at the table, reviewing the documents one final time. James had spread out his father's original deed alongside the papers Thornton had left. In the lamplight, Eleanor could see the differences, subtle but present. The territorial seal on James's deed was genuine, deeply embossed and detailed. The seal on Thornton's papers was a good copy, but not quite perfect. They were counting on us, not looking too closely, James said, pointing out the discrepancies. Most people wouldn't notice these details, but I worked in a law office for 15 years. I know what legitimate documents look like. Will the officials in the capital see the same things you see? Eleanor asked. If they're honest, yes. My father's old colleagues were men of integrity. At least, most of them were. James's expression darkened. But the Blackwells have had months to work on this. They might have gotten to some of them, offered bribes or made threats. We have to be prepared for that possibility. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Then we'll find the honest ones. We'll keep looking until we find someone who can't be bought or intimidated. James turned his hand to clasp hers, and they sat like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. Finally, Eleanor spoke the question that had been weighing on her mind. James, if this goes badly, if we lose the homestead, what will you do? He was quiet for a moment, considering. I don't know. I can't go back east. The Blackwells have made that impossible. I suppose I'd head further west, find some place they haven't reached yet. And would you go alone? The question came out smaller than Eleanor intended, revealing more vulnerability than she wanted to show. James's eyes met hers. That depends on you, Eleanor. If we lose this fight, if you lose your home, I won't abandon you, not unless you want me to go. I don't want you to go, Eleanor said quietly. Win or lose, I don't want you to go. James stood and came around the table, pulling Eleanor to her feet. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle and warm. Then I won't. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. They stood close, the air between them charged with unspoken feeling. James leaned down slowly, giving Eleanor every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender and searching, a promise and a question all at once. When they finally separated, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I never thought I could feel this way again, she whispered. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I never thought I could feel this way at all, James replied, his arms wrapped around her. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found you. They held each other in the quiet cabin, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges and dangers. But tonight they had this moment of peace and connection. Finally, reluctantly, they separated. There was still work to do before they could leave at dawn. Eleanor went to her bedroom and selected a trunk, packing clothing suitable for town and for the potentially lengthy legal proceedings ahead. She packed her best dress, the one she wore to church, simple but respectable, and the blue fabric James had bought her, still uncut but precious. She packed Thomas's wedding ring on a chain, something she could not bear to leave behind. James prepared their provisions and gear, making sure they had everything needed for the 2-day ride to the territorial capital. He cleaned and loaded Thomas's shotgun, checking the ammunition carefully. Eleanor watched him work, seeing the serious, focused man he became when dealing with potential danger. "Do you think Thornton's men will try to stop us?" she asked. "I think they'll watch to see what we do. If we're just leaving, abandoning the property, they might let us go. But if they realize we're going to fight, they might try to interfere." James set the shotgun aside and looked at her seriously. "We need to be careful, Eleanor. Watch the trail. Don't make camp anywhere too exposed. These men are dangerous." "I'm not afraid," Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize it was mostly true. Fear was present, but it was overshadowed by determination. They went to bed late, both too anxious for tomorrow to sleep easily. Eleanor lay in her room, listening to the sounds of James moving in his small space, and felt the pull of wanting to go to him, to not spend this night alone. But that was a line they had not yet crossed, and despite their kiss, despite their acknowledged feelings, she was not ready to take that step. Dawn came cold and clear. They rose, ate a quick breakfast, and loaded their horses. Eleanor took one last look at her cabin, at the home she and Thomas had built, and said a silent prayer that she would return to it. They rode to the Miller place first, their nearest neighbors 5 miles down the valley. Samuel Miller was a gruff but kind man in his 60s who had known Thomas well. When James explained the situation, carefully editing out the more dangerous details, Samuel agreed immediately to check on the livestock while they were gone. "Those investment company vultures," Samuel spat, "been sniffing around other properties too, trying to find technical flaws in old deeds. Don't you worry, Mrs. Hartwell. We'll take care of your place, and if any of Thornton's men show their faces, they'll find a less than friendly welcome." Eleanor thanked him, grateful for the frontier solidarity that made neighbors into allies. As they rode away from the Miller place, she felt marginally better knowing someone would be watching over her homestead. The ride to the capital was long but uneventful. They traveled carefully, taking breaks to rest the horses and watching the trail for any sign of followers. James was vigilant, his hand never far from his rifle, but they encountered no trouble. They camped the first night in a sheltered draw, taking turns on watch while the others slept. In the quiet hours of her watch, Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange path her life had taken. 6 months ago she had been alone, struggling, with no future beyond the next season. Now she was riding through the mountains with a man she had come to love. Yes, love. She could admit it to herself, now fighting for a future she had not dared to imagine. The second day brought them to the territorial capital as the sun was setting. The town was larger than Pine Ridge, with actual streets and buildings of stone rather than just wood. The territorial offices occupied an impressive structure at the town's center, with the seal of Montana Territory carved into the granite above the entrance. They found lodging at a respectable boarding house, taking separate rooms to maintain propriety. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Patterson, looked them over carefully before agreeing to rent to them. "We're here on legal business," James explained. "I'm presenting a property claim to the Territorial Land Office." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You'll want to speak with Judge Carmichael then. He handles most of the complex property cases. His office is next to the land office, but he's usually there early in the morning. Court doesn't convene until 9. That evening, James and Eleanor took a meal in the boarding house's dining room. Other guests were present, and conversation was necessarily careful. But afterward, standing in the hallway outside their rooms, James took Eleanor's hand. "Tomorrow we start the real fight," he said quietly. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I can be," Eleanor replied. "James, whatever happens, I want you to know I'm glad you came to my door that night. I'm glad you stayed. Even if we lose everything else, I'm glad I got to know you." James raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "We're not going to lose, Eleanor. I won't let them take what's yours. What's ours?" They parted for the night, each retiring to their separate rooms. Eleanor lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the town outside her window, so different from the quiet of her mountain homestead. She thought about tomorrow, about facing officials and lawyers, about presenting their case and hoping that justice would prevail. She thought about James's father's old colleagues, the men he had known and worked with. Would they remember Robert Callahan? Would they honor his memory by helping his son? Or had the Blackwells reached them already, poisoning the well with bribes or threats? Sleep came eventually, fitful and filled with anxious dreams. But when dawn broke and Eleanor rose to face the day, she felt something she had not expected: hope. Not naive, innocent hope, but the harder, more resilient kind that comes from knowing you have something worth fighting for and someone to fight alongside. She dressed in her best clothes, pinned her hair up carefully, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked older than she remembered, but also stronger. The mountains and the struggles had marked her, but they had not broken her. A knock came at her door. James stood in the hallway, also dressed formally, looking almost like a city lawyer again. But his eyes held the warmth she had come to know, the gentle strength that had made her trust him. "Ready?" he asked. Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." Together, they descended the stairs and stepped out into the morning, heading toward the territorial offices and whatever judgment awaited them there. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, enough time for Thornton to be officially notified and for Judge Carmichael to gather initial evidence. James and Eleanor remained in town, waiting and preparing. They spent their time reviewing documents, discussing strategy, and trying not to think too much about what failure would mean. On the morning of the hearing, they arrived at the courthouse early. The room was formal and imposing, with high ceilings and rows of benches for observers. Several people were already present, including Samuel Miller and 2 other neighbors from Pine Ridge who had ridden in to testify on Eleanor's behalf. Thornton arrived with 2 lawyers, both dressed in expensive Eastern suits. They carried briefcases full of papers and wore expressions of supreme confidence. Thornton himself smirked when he saw James and Eleanor, clearly believing he held all the advantages. Judge Carmichael entered, and the room rose. He took his seat at the bench and surveyed everyone present with the calm authority of a man who had presided over countless such proceedings. "This is a hearing to determine the rightful ownership of property designated as Tract 47 in the Mountain District," Carmichael began. "Mr. Callahan claims ownership through inheritance. Mr. Thornton, representing the Mountain Valley Investment Company, claims ownership through purchase from the territorial government. We're here to examine the validity of both claims." Thornton's lead lawyer stood. "Your Honor, our case is straightforward. The Mountain Valley Investment Company purchased this land legally from the Territorial Land Office 6 months ago. We have documentation showing that the previous claim was invalid due to incomplete registration. Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Callahan are squatters with no legal standing." "I've reviewed your documentation," Carmichael said dryly. "I have some questions about it, but first let's hear from Mr. Callahan." James stood, and Eleanor was struck by how different he seemed: confident, articulate, every inch the lawyer he had been trained to be. "Your Honor, my father, Robert Callahan, purchased this land 30 years ago in a transaction personally overseen by then Territorial Governor Mitchell. The deed was properly registered and has been maintained through continuous tax payments. I have the original document here, complete with the territorial seal." He presented the deed, and Carmichael examined it again, this time for the record. "This appears to be genuine," Carmichael said. "It bears Governor Mitchell's signature, which I recognize, and the seal is authentic. Mr. Thornton's lawyer, can you explain how your company purchased land that was already deeded to another party?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The land office records showed the property as available. We relied on the official records provided to us. Which official provided these records? Carmichael asked. A Mr. Harrison Webb, clerk in the land office. Carmichael's expression hardened. Clerk Webb is not authorized to approve land sales. That authority rests with the Territorial Land Commissioner. Did you obtain Commissioner Reeves's signature on your purchase documents? The lawyer consulted his papers quickly. The documentation shows proper approval. Let me see it, Carmichael demanded. The lawyer handed over the papers, and Carmichael studied them closely. After a long moment, he looked up. This signature is forged. I've known Commissioner Reeves for 20 years. This is not his signature. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thornton's face went pale, then flushed with anger. We were assured these documents were legitimate. By whom? Carmichael asked sharply. Who assured you? Thornton's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked trapped, and Eleanor realized he was weighing his options: protect his employers or face charges himself. Finally, James stood again. Your Honor, if I may, I believe Mr. Thornton was acting on behalf of the Blackwell family of Philadelphia. They have reason to want me forced off this land, and they have a history of using fraudulent documentation to achieve their business objectives. That's a serious accusation, Carmichael said. I have proof, James replied. Letters from their lawyers attempting to coerce me into returning east. References to handling the Montana property situation. I can provide copies of correspondence that links the Blackwells to the Mountain Valley Investment Company. Thornton stood abruptly. This is outrageous. We're being slandered. Sit down, Mr. Thornton, Carmichael ordered. I'll hear what Mr. Callahan has to present. James laid out the evidence he had brought: carefully preserved letters, documents showing the corporate structure linking Mountain Valley to Blackwell interests, and testimony from associates back east who had witnessed the Blackwells' threats. It painted a damning picture of conspiracy and fraud. When James finished, Carmichael was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mr. Callahan's deed is legitimate and binding. The Mountain Valley Investment Company's claim is based on fraudulent documents and is therefore void. The property remains under the ownership of James Callahan, with Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell recognized as having significant equity interest through her years of occupation and improvement. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. But Carmichael wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the activities of Clerk Webb and the Mountain Valley Investment Company. If evidence of fraud is confirmed, criminal charges will be filed. Mr. Thornton, you and your associates are ordered to cease all activities related to this property immediately. Thornton stood, his face twisted with rage. This isn't over. The Blackwells have no standing in this territory, Carmichael interrupted. And if they continue to harass Mr. Callahan or Mrs. Hartwell, they will find themselves facing federal charges for interstate fraud and conspiracy. Do I make myself clear? Thornton said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. He gathered his papers and stalked from the courtroom, his lawyers hurrying after him. James turned to Eleanor, and she saw the relief and joy in his eyes. They had done it. They had fought the powerful and won. The homestead was safe, their future was secure, and they had each other. Carmichael banged his gavel. This hearing is concluded. Mr. Callahan, Mrs. Hartwell, I'll have the official documentation prepared within the week. In the meantime, you're free to return to your property with full legal protection. As they left the courthouse, surrounded by their neighbors who had come to support them, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of fear and uncertainty had lifted, replaced by hope and possibility. Spring came to the mountains with the kind of gentle beauty that made Eleanor understand why people chose to live in such unforgiving country. The snow melted from the high peaks, sending crystal streams rushing through the valleys. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant colors, and on the porch of the Hartwell homestead, two rocking chairs sat side by side, both occupied now. 6 months had passed since the hearing in the territorial capital. Judge Carmichael had been true to his word. The official documentation had been filed, recognizing both James and Eleanor as legal co-owners of the property. Clerk Webb had been arrested and charged with fraud. The Mountain Valley Investment Company had been dissolved, its assets frozen, and though the Blackwells had made some noise from Philadelphia, threatening lawsuits and investigations, nothing had come of it. Distance and the integrity of the territorial justice system had protected James and Eleanor. More than that, the community had rallied around them. Samuel Miller and the other neighbors had spread the story of how the widow, Hartwell, and Robert Callahan's son had stood up to Eastern corruption and won. It had become a point of local pride, a tale told in the general store and the church social hall. Eleanor and James had gone from being subjects of wary gossip to being respected members of the frontier community. The homestead itself had been transformed. James had spent the winter months making improvements, a new addition to the cabin, repairs to the barn, an expansion of the garden plot. What had been a struggling property, maintained by one woman's determined effort, had become a thriving operation managed by two people working in harmony. But the most significant change was not to the property. It was to the two people who lived there. Eleanor stood in the bedroom that had once been hers alone, studying her reflection in the small mirror. She wore the dress made from the blue fabric James had bought her all those months ago. It fit perfectly, the work of her careful sewing through the long winter evenings. Today was her wedding day. A knock came at the door. Eleanor? It was Martha Collins, who had overcome her initial nosiness to become a genuine friend. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, opening the door. Martha smiled warmly. "You look beautiful. Thomas would be happy for you, you know. He was a good man who loved you well. He wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone." Eleanor touched the chain around her neck, where Thomas's wedding ring hung alongside her own. She had put them there the night before, a way of honoring her first marriage while embracing her second. "I know. I've made my peace with it. Thomas gave me 20 good years. James is giving me a future I never thought I'd have again." They walked together to where the ceremony would take place under the large pine tree behind the cabin, the same tree where Thomas had proposed to her all those years ago. The community had gathered, perhaps 30 people from Pine Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. Samuel Miller was there with his wife. The Reverend had ridden up from town, and standing beneath the tree, dressed in his best suit with his hair neatly trimmed, was James. He turned when he saw her approaching, and the look on his face made Eleanor's heart swell. It was not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper, a steady, enduring love built on partnership, respect, and genuine affection. This was not a marriage of convenience or necessity. This was a choice they were both making freely, with full hearts and clear minds. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. The Reverend spoke of love and commitment, of two people joining their lives together in service to each other and to God. When the time came for vows, James took Eleanor's hands in his and spoke clearly. "Eleanor, when I came to your door that storm night, I was lost. I had property and money, but no home, no purpose, no reason to get up each morning beyond simple survival. You gave me all of that. You gave me a place to belong, work that matters, and a love I never believed I deserved. I promise to honor you, to stand beside you through whatever comes, and to build with you a life worth living." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks, but they were good tears. "James, I thought my life was over when Thomas died. I thought I had used up my share of happiness and love. You showed me I was wrong. You showed me that the heart has room for both grief and joy, that honoring the past doesn't mean giving up the future. I promise to love you, to be your partner in all things, and to build with you something beautiful from the kindness we showed each other on a dark night." The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed her gently, respectfully, before their assembled community. Applause and cheers rose from the gathered neighbors, genuine expressions of joy and support. The celebration that followed was modest but warm food, shared potluck style, music from Samuel's fiddle, dancing on the grass, and stories told around the fire as evening fell. Eleanor and James moved through it together, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but both looking forward to when the guests would leave and they would finally be alone. As the sun set and the guests began departing for their own homes, Eleanor and James stood on their porch, watching the last wagons roll down the mountain trail. The storm lantern hung by the door, its light warm and welcoming. The two rocking chairs waited side by side. "Well, Mrs. Callahan," James said, slipping his arm around Eleanor's waist, "what do you think of your wedding day?" Eleanor leaned into him, feeling safe and content. "I think it's been perfect, simple and honest, just like everything else about us." They stood together in the gathering darkness. Looking out over the land, they now shared the land that had brought them together, through an inheritance and a storm, through legal battles and growing affection. The homestead spread before them, solid and enduring, a testament to the life they had built and would continue building together. "Do you ever think about that night?" Eleanor asked. "When you knocked on my door?" "Every day," James replied. "I think about how close I came, to not stopping, to just riding past your cabin to find shelter elsewhere. I think about all the choices that had to align perfectly to bring us to this moment. Thomas used to say that life was made up of small moments that turn out to be big ones," Eleanor said softly. "Opening a door, offering coffee, staying when you could have left. All of it mattered." James turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You saved my life that night, Eleanor. Not just from the storm, but from a life of emptiness and running. You gave me a home." "We gave each other a home," Eleanor corrected. "That's what partnership means." They went inside together, closing the door on the spring evening. The storm lantern continued to burn in the window, a beacon for any traveler who might need shelter, a symbol of the kindness that had transformed two lonely lives into one shared journey. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But inside the cabin, two people had discovered that even in the hardest country, even after loss and loneliness, love could bloom again. Not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as something new and precious in its own right. The two rocking chairs remained on the porch, waiting for tomorrow's sunset. One had been built by Thomas, a legacy of Eleanor's first love. The other had been built by James, a promise of her second. Together, they represented not a choice between past and present, but an integration of both a life that honored what had been while embracing what could be. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Eleanor had learned that truth on a storm-battered night, and she and James lived it every day thereafter, building a future from the simple decision to open a door to a stranger in need.